Welcome to the Carbonsations podcast, where we speak to some of the leading figures in the emerging carbon industry. Our guest today is Martin Freimüller, founder and CEO of Octavia Carbon, Kenya-based direct air capture company. Martin, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. Traditionally on this podcast, we want to learn more about our guest's background prior to entering the carbon industry. So if you don't mind, I'd love it if you could share with us what you were up to before founding Octavia.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on. Huge fan of the podcast and the newsletter as well. Happy to quickly talk about myself. So in a previous life, I was a strategy consultant with Dalberg Global Advisors, so in the international development space specifically, and ran into carbon removal as a means of creating quality livelihoods on the African continent, where all of us know that we have to build a very large industry. And Africa in various ways is quite well positioned to take advantage of that opportunity, having a lot of the right natural and also human resources, very importantly. And then, became the global firm's carbon guy for a long time, covered everything carbon market related, carbon removal related, and developed a slight love relationship with direct air capture, and also realized that Kenya is the world's best place for it, because it has the world's best energy, geology, and talent to build it at massive scale. And that sort of convinced me to move my life to Kenya, together with my wife in late 2021. And I then started Octavia together with my two colleagues, Duncan and Mike, in June 2022. And now, less than 2 years later, there's about 55 of us and growing. So definitely has been quite a ride. And also hoping to become the world's second ever to inject CO2 underground as a DAC company later this year, together with the partners at Setup. But I'm quite particular from the actual conversation.
Wow. So would you mind sharing why specifically DAC of all the other available carbon removal pathways?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I think I definitely was always a techno optimist. I think direct air capture being the hardest technological problem that you could possibly imagine is definitely alluring to techno optimists. And I think that is something that both our boosters and our critics, I think, this is pretty much the conclusion that we all have in common. I think there's just a lot of scalability, replicability, and fidelity in direct air capture as a carbon removal approach. And fundamentally, it has a lot of the right sort of characteristics, being a modular technology, to go down the cost curve fast enough to make a real dent in the fight against climate change. And just want to be clear on the timeframe is there to do so within the next decade or two as well.
Okay, and could you perhaps describe what those first days of starting Octavia Carbon looked like, and maybe if you could speak to the partnership with Sela as well?
No, totally. It's one of those sort of instances of what you might call engineered luck, and in that sense, it just illustrates that Kenya is a very good place to build direct air capture. Because funny enough, the journey for me pretty much started on the A-Miners launch pad, and big shout out to Tito, Jason, and everyone in the crew, Adina, etc. And the other person that was in that A-Miners launch pad cohort with me was a gentleman keen to do enhanced rock weathering on the African continent. That gentleman is called Corey Patterson, and we talked a lot about direct air capture at that time and so on. And he then soon went off and started Sela Mineral Storage. And we've been working together in very close partnership ever since. I mean, Corey went out and found himself the most fantastic co-founder you could wish for in a mineralization startup, which is Dr. Claire Nelson out of Columbia University. And the two of them have since absolutely knocked it out of the park. And also, just to be clear, it's not an exclusive partnership. They are working with other DAC companies too. But we are very glad to have them in Kenya and to have them sort of as a partner. And then the sort of step beyond that was for Duncan, Mike and I to start sort of mid-2022 together. And it literally was on my kitchen table for the first month. And bouncing ideas around, etc. From there, it sort of went into a small apartment and then a slightly larger apartment, bouncing ideas around, setting up DAC machines in master bedrooms. So in sort of all not making ourselves very popular with our neighbors, but at the same time growing and learning very quickly, and building our own direct air capture technology that's uniquely well suited to take advantage of Kenya's endowments. And that sort of thread has sort of gone all the way through. And we then sort of at some point found ourselves a nice sort of manufacturing space with 10,000 square feet. And that has since become very small. And we've had a second one of those. So we now have about 3,000 square feet of manufacturing space just on the outskirts of Nairobi, where anyone who's listening to this is very welcome anytime you pass by Nairobi.
Oh, now, since you mentioned it, and it's a question that I think is on the minds of all of our listeners, certainly on my mind, why Kenya? What makes Kenya so special specifically for DAC?
Yeah, no, it's true. And I think it's sort of split between, I think, a subset of people who haven't heard this before. It's like, oh, Kenya, that's interesting. And I think a lot of people are like tired of hearing it because we've been trumpeting it a lot. But yeah, so why Kenya? And I think the main and most important reason to understand here is that DAC is thermodynamically energy intensive. So to concentrate DAC from atmospheric concentrations to sort of like, highly concentrated form takes about 128 kilowatt hours of minimum work just thermodynamically. And again, like it will take a long time until we can approximate anything near this sort of thermodynamic efficiency. And so inherently you want to go to a place that has a lot of renewable energy in very abundant forms. And energy there is key. And again, that's an insight that Carbonworks is very much sort of generated for this whole space because it doesn't have to be electricity. It can also be heat. And if you look at places that have abundant heat, geothermal places couldn't like fit the perfect description there. Because they also tend to have the best geology and the recent basaltic rock that is very well suited to actually reacting with CO2 to form carbonate minerals and store CO2 forever. And then specifically for Kenya, also the right talent pool that we know from literally every other wave of climate tech, whether it's solar or batteries or EVs, that global south ingenuity and talent that it takes to bring technology down the cost curve. And yeah, put these three together, like energy, geology, and talent. And Kenya is the world's best place for DAC. And it is the world's best place for DAC today, because, today we have a grid that's like nearly 100% renewable. The actual substations that we draw power from are literally 100% renewable, geothermal and wind. And then even in the longer term, Kenya is right on the equator, meaning it will have some of the best solar in the world. It has very good winds, it has very good hydro, and it has lots and lots and lots of geothermal. Kenya is literally intended to be the world's largest geothermal producer a few years from now. And so that essentially makes us excited to really build out an approach here that uniquely leverages these endowments and sort of applies some of the learnings from the geothermal sector. And again, there's a lot of them because Kenya has quadrupled its geothermal capacity to close to a gigawatt over the past decade. And really applied it very directly to DAC in a way that we're quite uniquely positioned for being based in Kenya.
Wow, that's certainly news to me. It's not something that's talked about very widely. Thank you for sharing. And also on that note, what is the political landscape like for CDR in Kenya? Is there government support for these types of projects? And how do local communities feel about them as well, actually?
Yeah, great question. So I just come from a 2 days government conference on carbon markets, but carbon removal is very much a sort of highlight that they think about there. And the short answer is that there is a lot of excitement about making Kenya a hub for direct air capture. And again, it's interesting to see that Octavia gets a lot of clout in these conversations these days as well. And so they are thinking about, how they can incentivize this, with tax breaks and various other incentives, especially to people who produce and develop locally. But look, Kenya is not a rich country, and it does not have the scope to sort of provide the same sort of financial support to the sector that, say, somebody like the US or folks in the US or in Canada would be able to. And that is key difference. I mean, I think Kenya banks on being sort of the most cost-effective place regardless, which is, of course, a bold bet, but with the resources that it has, it might just about be able to do so. But that very much is a big part of the excitement here. Also, because it would make the geothermal sector vastly more bankable by providing industrial baseline offtake, which they've been looking for a long time in the Kenyan government. And then also by essentially cross-subsidizing a lot of the electricity from eliminating some of the waste that's inherent to today's geothermal capacity, geothermal heat, and also geothermal infrastructure. And basically, that also trickles down to the communities because people understand that there is a large potential sector that can grow. It is, of course, quite novel, and I think that's not new to Kenya. DAC is novel everywhere, but we have been getting a lot of traction from people who understand that geothermal is a very abundant source of energy. I mean, they're literally used to seeing plumes of it come from the ground on sort of cold, like mornings, and that it makes intuitive sense that, like, as everyone knows about climate change because they're very directly experiencing it, that Kenya is a unique place to also tackle that using some of that renewable energy that is abundant here, much more than in most other places. So we have been doing like 3 community engagement sessions to date. We're now moving to more or less like a sort of monthly or bi-monthly format for them. We just, like, as we get very much closer to a field deployment, making sure we have very strong sort of buy-in as well. And we're also working on ways of actually creating apprenticeships for the local community too. And, like, again, we are uniquely positioned to do this because, we are a 98% Kenyan team. It's literally me and something like 54 Kenyans or so. And it obviously matters deeply that the people you talk to in the local communities like recognize themselves in who they speak to. And so the fact that this is a technology that's like developed by Kenyans in Kenya for Kenyans in many ways makes a big difference. It's like it generates a different level of trust if the people developing this tech are able to speak the local language, Swahili, right? It's just a level of trust that an outsider could never generate, which is also why I'm personally a lot more likely involved in the process, and that's very much led by our sort of policy team inside Octavia. But yeah, I hope that gives you an idea of what the reception generally is like locally.
Absolutely. Thank you. Now, I also wanted to touch on Octavia's major recent news, which was the launch of the world's first digital monitoring, verification, and reporting system for DAC, together with Carbonfuture, which is one of the leading, if not the leading, carbon removal providers to date. So that's very exciting news, and I'd love it if you could tell us more about what this is, how it works, and why essentially it's so important for the industry at large.
No, I totally agreed. And huge shout out there to Berta and Marcus and Hannes and the whole fabulous Carbonfuture team. So again, the idea behind DAC, and I think really like the mission that DAC has today is to redefine what carbon removal looks like, or like frankly, what a carbon credit looks like. Because at the moment, it's kind of like, the most sort of opaque type of product that you could possibly buy, because it's like, a ton of some invisible gas somewhere in the sky, somewhere supposedly removed, but really like a bunch of Excel numbers saying something or other, right? And I think it's about time that we, at least in DAC, move away from that and actually fully leverage the capabilities that we have to actually say, look, these are molecules of CO2 that are running down a pipe. We can measure them to the gram. We can report that measurement live. And we can literally have a live ticker on our website or Carbonfuture's website, because again, ultimately we want this to be believable. So it should be a third party doing that reporting and monitoring. And then, yeah, you don't have to trust us because it's literally like molecules of CO2 running down a pipe. And I think, I'm from a consulting background. I've built plenty of models before, and anything to do with Excel and anything that is modeled is inherently subject to distortions, to put it mildly. And it is also tricky because I think inherently, if those distortions enable good work, you also have an incentive to slightly, choose your numbers favorably. And then again, that is something that the carbon markets all over have been very prone to. And I think ultimately we want to move to a commodities business, right? If I buy a kilogram of gold, then I expect to get exactly 1 kilogram of gold, right? It's not like, yeah, it's probably a kilogram of gold. It's like maybe plus minus 20%. It's probably more. Or like, somebody might say, oh yeah, but there's a lot of dodgy providers out there. You shouldn't trust them. But, trust us. We're doing this well because X, Y, Z reason. Again, that's not how commodities markets function. To commodities markets need to be ultra fungible. So it's not so much a question of, okay, case by case, project by project, literally ton by ton. Is this a good ton or a bad ton? But it's like very simply like a ton, like a ton of CO2 moving down a pipe. And I think as you sort of want to move like carbon removal to like a highly fungible, highly liquid market, that is the level of fidelity that frankly everyone should strive for. And I think we at Octavia pride ourselves at just, producing the world's best carbon credits and also positioning Kenyan DAC from the start as having an absolute obsession with quality. Again, the way that, like Japanese knives that you might see on YouTube are like another level of quality from something you might find somewhere else, or like Japanese bullet trains, take the example. The point is we have an obsession with quality at Octavia, and that is something that we want our customers to know from the start. And so we are thrilled to be partnering with, again, the largest marketplace in, carbon removal on their sort of first direct air capture project, to really like show that we can do this uniquely well from the start with, our first project in the Kenyan Rift Valley becoming the world's second ever to inject CO2 underground. We're also uniquely well placed to pilot these new levels of quality that just haven't ever been seen before in carbon markets.
So with that said, then perhaps you could also provide us a bit more details on Octavia's DAC facility in Kenya, the Project Hummingbird. How far along is it, first of all, and what removal capacity is it expected to have, as well as when we can expect it to become operational? All these things that you're ready to share without revealing anything confidential, of course.
Totally. And there is sadly a few confidential bits, but what I can say, and that is exciting enough in itself, is that the site is now being developed initially by Seller and then very soon by us as well. In the next quarter, we sort of intend to actually start the intense planning, and then sort of at the start of Q3 to actually move hardware there as well. And then gradually bring online that project over the next sort of months following that. We already have a demo plant inside our Nairobi facilities, which sort of model all the sort of necessary plant processes. And from there, we'll intend to bring that Project Hummingbird online by the end of this year. So like around about November or December. The phase 1 might be about 250 tons of capacity. The phase 2 that will follow quite shortly after will be 1,000 tons per year. And then from there, again, the geological storage site is extremely scalable, and so are we. So we are looking forward to sign some larger offtake agreements to then really take that plant to like massive capacity, and again, hope to have a feasible shot at making it the world's largest direct air capture facility. Very much in the race to build that megaton plant. So excited to see what Kenya has to offer there. And I think one thing that will, of course, help us is that, as far as we know, at least on an unsubsidized basis, we're also the world's most cost-effective with that pilot. So excited to drive DAC down the cost curve with our various partners on the demand side as well.
How do you see that happening, though, in the years to come? Maybe not just in your case, not just for your project, but in DAC in general. How do you see the cost curve coming down? What are your projections, say? So
we're bullish, and I do think it's important to classify that a bit, because I think there's a lot of DAC companies that are bullish, and I think it's funny because there was a great discussion recently on the costs of DAC, and I think going all sorts of ways and all kinds of people getting involved. I think and there was that one really interesting sort of addition to that by Robert Hoagland from sort of the recent sort of applications from the Milky Wire Climate Transformation Funds applications. And it is interesting to reflect on the past year since we sent that, successful application at the time, because the costs go up as you get closer to the project. Again, I think one thing that I dare say probably most DAC companies really underestimate is the complexity of building a plant. Actually building a plant that integrates with a geological storage partner and actually takes you to below ground at very very hard specifications and continuously and at high maintenance factors and so on. At high capacity factors, I mean. That is tricky. And as such, I do think the first of a kind, and this is just to be clear, this is a real first of a kind. It's an actual first of the kind, puts you two in the ground, sell a carbon credit. That is going to be expensive. But even with that, we sort of are pretty bullish on the costs that we expect. And I think one thing that's sort of quite often noted is that from 2011, there's a paper that said that can never get below $600 per ton. I can say that this project will prove that assertion wrong. But after that, again, we do see quite a few more cost saving in the pipeline, and sort of looking to touch a sort of level of $400 per ton ish. Again, unsubsidized. Important to clarify here. Sort of in the years after that, probably mid-decade, late mid-decade thereabouts, and then by 2030, we think a lot is possible. Again, a lot of is possible if you can leverage Kenya's talent as a low cost manufacturing base to really lower the cost of capex, because fundamentally the inputs to our DAC process are cheap. So really the question here is can you build it cost effectively? And we can. And then this second element to there is beyond the capex, it's the opex, and the opex is in many ways determined with where your energy comes from. And our energy, again, using heat in Kenya is ultra cheap. We're talking like literally about a cent per kilowatt hour. And that will ultimately allow us to really push down the OPEX drastically as well. So we think that by 2030, we can be in the sort of cost range of about $100 to $150 per ton. And, like I completely understand that there is a big burden of proof that we have to sort of carry. But we think it's entirely feasible. And there is fundamentally nothing that and I think, again, lots of discussions about like what like the fundamental costs of DAC are. I will say that a lot of the assertions of like where DAG's costs can end up are like such a tiresome discussion of like, what are learning rates over the past decades for different types of technology? And then there's like all this guessing about, is DAC more like natural gas? Is DAC more like solar? Is DAC more like wind? And then people try to apply different historical learning rates for this different technologies to DAC. And it's just fundamentally not how that stuff actually comes down the cost curve. It's like literally like component by component. You think about, okay, how can I optimize this thing? Which is also why it just takes people. It takes lots and lots of brains. Like I think lots of DAC companies like, Flog, there's like one great innovation that they have. And it's great. Like we should encourage like, creative thinking on different forms of innovations. But the truth is that DAC is never just one innovation. It takes lots and lots and lots of engineering works to solve like lots of second and third order problems that, like are unsexy, right? Like, like energy recovery, like heat utilization, mass transfer. But even like incremental improvements on all of these give you that sort of extra $2-3 per ton that you save in costs. And that is ultimately what we can do uniquely well, because we can just fundamentally marshal more brains to the task. You can literally give 10 Kenyans a very decent lifestyle for the same cost of doing that for one engineer in San Francisco. So by the principle of human equality, again, Octavia is uniquely positioned to drive DAC down the cost curve really quickly. And I think that's ultimately something that, solar was dismissed for years and years and years, because I think people really understood how that tech actually came down the cost curve. Because again, here's another thing that people get wrong about learning rates. People average costs across the solar industries from, like say 2000 to 2010 or whatever, and then they derive a learning rate for that time period. But the truth is that there were literally some producers that were producing at half the cost or much less, or like sometimes even like a fifth of the cost of those elsewhere. And frankly, all of those low cost producers were based in the global south. And so the way that solar came down the cost curve is, yes, everyone had like technological learnings at, a few percentage points here, but the real cost savings that occurred is that the global south producers gained market share from the global north producers. And that brought down the costs of solar for everyone, basically, right? And that is ultimately how these learnings occurred. I think the reason why nobody was expecting is because people looked at the technological learning in solar and be like, yeah, okay, so these solar cells can get X or that better and so on. But the truth is that the way like most of these learnings occurred is just being economically more efficient in terms of your supply chain and where you build them. And another thing that might be worth noting there is that the prices of solar panels have crashed much quicker than that of like solar electricity and solar energy more broadly, because so much of like solar's costs actually the stupid or like soft costs of putting the thing on your roof. But that doesn't have to be the case for DAC, because DAC, much as it is modular, can be sort of highly centralized around storage locations. And then in that sense also like drive learnings much faster without sort of like soft costs that constrain something like solar or wind or others. So yeah, we're very bullish on where the costs of DAC can go, and we see ourselves as those sort of global south upstarts that can upset the sector like in a fundamental way, being the first and so far still the only at least sizable global south player in this ecosystem.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I also wanted to touch on the market side of things. I know that you partnered with Climate Co, and this year you already celebrated your first pre-purchase, correct me if I'm wrong, of carbon removal credits.
It's not quite the first, but it is a sizable one, yeah.
So could you please tell us more about this deal, maybe other deals that you've already had, and how things are looking on the demand side for DAC carbon removals?
Yeah, no, I think, again, big shout out to the folks at Climate Co, Simon, Lauren, and the team. There are lots of shout outs, but we are very grateful to our partners. We couldn't do it without them. And so, yeah, I think that's been a fantastic deal. There was close to 1,000 tons. And as far as CDR.FY goes, at least is like the 30th largest known DAC deal, I think. It may have still changed. Obviously, the market is changing really quickly, but it is sizable and we're proud of that. Yeah, and that essentially like allows us to now build the hardware to actually like deliver these credits like at scale from like later this year really. And beyond that, we have a lot of fantastic partners, the Milky Way Climate Transformation Fund that I mentioned is one of them. That was our first purchase, but that was sort of mid last year. Then there's lots of others, TerraSet, some that we're likely to announce soon. And so we're obviously quite excited about those partnerships. And yeah, essentially the market for DAG is evolving. It is. I will lie that it is a tough market because fundamentally you're trying to convince somebody to pay, let's say upwards of $600 for a carbon credit. That might quite literally be 100 times more than they used to pay for a carbon credit, and that is not an even felt conversation. And I think a lot of credit there is due to the various sort of marketplaces and intermediaries and brokers that are having these tough conversations and actually going out and mobilizing the demand amongst corporates, doing a lot of diligence on various projects like us, and then actually pointing people towards where there are good DAG projects that are worthy of support. Again, Climate Go being a sort of key player that comes to mind there, alongside lots of others, of course. And yeah, I think the market is obviously growing pretty quickly. We saw on CDR.FY, I think it's 7x growth from 2022 to 2023. I think a similar dynamic is playing out at DAG. I think at DAG too, there's a lot of sort of mega deals that still take a sort of a large share of these credits. And I think for smaller DAG innovators, it can be a bit hard, right? Because you have a lot of burden of proof on you. And one of them is just that there's very few storage sites to actually put your CO2. So even if you can concentrate atmospheric CO2 from 400 ppm to, high concentrations, which is hard enough to start with, you still have to actually find a project and then do that there. And again, we're obviously quite fortunate, or engineered luck, as I said earlier, in Kenya to have that storage site. But of course, inherently, a buyer takes on a lot of risk in making such a catalytic purchase, and it's to the immense credits of Stripe, Shopify, Frontier, the whole various groups of catalytic buyers that we know and love, that they're making these sort of these commitments and creating that really market for their data capture. So yeah, I think that's sort of what the dynamic looks like from the supplier side. It is definitely daunting, and we are reliant on the help that we get from a marketplace and intermediary partners. And also feels on the courage of various sort of companies around the world making these commitments because they understand the climate science and want to really actually help us realize the technologies we need. But yeah, that market is there. It's growing. We've sold a good amount, and we're ramping up those sales very quickly as well. Also, as we head towards that being first ever, so being second ever to inject CO2 underground and first ever to do so in the global south. We're in a very strong position as we commercialize and always looking for partners. So always keen for folks to get in touch.
Brilliant. Now, Martin, before we wrap up, I do have one final question to ask you, and that is regarding Octavia's upcoming plans and announcements. Are there any exciting future developments that you can speak to and that we should be on the lookout for?
Lots, but few that I can speak to. So yeah, I think over the next sort of 2 months, we're expecting 4 pretty major announcements. But yeah, I think fundamentally, I think we see a lot of great partnerships in the space. That we all care about the same thing, which is taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and actually providing humanity with the tools it needs for net zero. And in that front, we're very proud to have already forged a lot of very fantastic partnerships in Carbonfuture, Climate Go, you name them. But looking forward to do so a lot more in future, both with buyers, also with various other sort of ecosystem providers, intermediaries, etc. Really innovating heavily on how DAG can sort of be packaged and sold, and I think in the process creating a market for DAG that's live and kicking. But that's sort of all that I will leave to that, and I recommend that everyone subscribes to our LinkedIn, where there will be a bunch of pretty major announcements soon. But on that note, the biggest thing that to look out for is for us to actually deliver on what we say, and for us to inject CO2 underground together with Seller later this year. We will be immensely proud when that happens, to show the world that Africans can build their future, and that they're uniquely equipped to bring DAC down the cost curve, which is the only reason why anyone should buy DAC today anyway. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the podcast. It was great to learn so much of what you guys do in Kenya right now. And it was a pleasure to speak to you.
Thanks for that. Bye.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Carbonsations podcast and would like to hear more conversations like this, please be sure to subscribe. We really appreciate the support.